Hello, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, EU Conflict Minerals, When, What, and How to Comply. We have some fantastic experts on the call today, so you can learn about key insights and answers to the conflict minerals regulation coming to the European Union later this year. Before we get started, we have some general housekeeping to go over. All PowerPoint slides and a recording of this webinar will be emailed once available. It will also be made available on our website, sourceintelligence.com/webinar library. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will do our best to answer all questions asked. Answers will be sent in a follow-up email after we conclude. You may also email questions directly to education@sourceintelligence.com. Okay, so for some brief introductions before we get started, my name is Jay Sailing. I'm a business development analyst here at Source Intelligence, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Our first guest today is Dinda Thomas, a partner at Squire Patton Boggs. As leader of the Squire Patton Boggs Conflict Minerals team, Dinda focuses on relevant industries' best practices in working with clients' legal, procurement, and compliance groups. Leah Butler will also take the stage. As Program Director of the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, Leah is responsible for oversight of the Conflict-Free Smelter Program and operations of the CFSI as a whole. Last but not least, we will hear from Lina Ramos. Lina is the Chief Business Officer and Executive Vice President of Source Intelligence. An expert at building technology-driven companies into profitable, high-growth businesses positioned for market leadership, Lina directs all expansion, partnership, and demand generation strategies at Source Intelligence. Here's a brief look at today's agenda. Dinda will speak on the newest updates on the EU legislation and a timeline for the decision. She will then move on to the main differences between the EU and the US legislations. She will also explain how to build your company's compliance program. Then, we will hear from Leah Butler as she discusses the challenges behind global supplier audits and the importance of cohesive smelter verification. Lastly, we will hear from Lina Ramos, who will go deeper into compliance with a case study depicting a multinational enterprise headquartered in the EU. Lina will give a detailed story behind their success and explain how technology helped their compliance needs. All right, let's get started. Let's hear from Dinda Thomas. Dinda, take it away.
Thank you, Jay, for that introduction, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk with this group today. For the last 3+ years, I've been working with companies from many different industries on responsible sourcing compliance. Many of these companies are from the US, but many of them are also from Asia, Australia, and Europe. And we've seen things that work, and we've seen things that don't work, and hopefully we can provide some of that insight here today. Now, first, of course, a warning. This session today is really very short, and there really isn't time to talk through everything you will need to know about the EU conflict minerals regulation that's coming. But it's really intended as an introduction to help you get to know a bit more about what is going to be required. And of course, lawyers always have a disclaimer slide, but really this is important here because responsible sourcing compliance is driven very much by a company's specific facts and circumstances. So you absolutely should seek legal advice in this area from experienced counsel to make sure that you're well advised. So let's step back a bit and start almost from the beginning. And for decades, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been embroiled in a violent civil war with over 10 million people killed, millions more brutalized and victimized. The DRC sits on vast amounts of valuable natural resources, and 4 of the most valuable of those are tin, tantalum, tungsten, and the ores from which they're derived, and gold. And those 4 are known as 3TG, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. Armed groups in the DRC have exploited these minerals resources and largely are financed by the mining and trade in these minerals. Now, these armed groups force Congolese civilians, including children, to work the mines. They're forced at gunpoint, of course, without financial benefit or without much financial benefit. Rape and torture of women is a common weapon to force cooperation. This is really a horrific situation. And so there are more and more stories and photos and videos available out there about all these atrocities, and people have become extremely frustrated with the lack of government solutions to these problems. And at the same time, there's a growing belief among NGOs and activists that business enterprises can provide solutions where governments cannot or have not. So nations and local governments have started to develop regulatory schemes that require companies to perform due diligence about the sourcing of conflict minerals and then disclose what they're doing to address those risks in their supply chains. Now, in response specifically to the atrocities in the Congo, the U.S. Congress passed some legislation that required a rule that would apply to SEC reporting companies and would require them to file disclosures about what they're doing to determine the source and chain of custody of 3TG and their products. I won't go through what the rule says, but the SEC issued this rule in August of 2012, and reporting companies have been undertaking investigation and due diligence since then, some even before then. So the U.S. rule requires information about the entire supply chain of a public company, top to bottom. Now, this slide really just is intended to prove the point of how prevalent 3TG are in our lives. They're everywhere. They impact almost every industry that has a product. Almost every consumer buys and holds goods that contain conflict minerals. And some of those goods that contain conflict minerals might even surprise you. So your industry may well be impacted by this regulation. Don't assume that it's not. So here's some key concepts and key terms that are important to understand before we really can go any further. 3TG are tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, regardless of where they come from. So if tin comes from Indonesia or the Congo, it's still called 3TG. Mineral sourcing regulations really here call for diligence and disclosure. So they are not a ban, they don't require an embargo, and they don't require product labels. It's important to keep all that in mind. These compliance efforts focus on the entire supply chain, and the EU regulation focuses on minerals that are sourced from, the phrase is, conflict-affected and high-risk areas anywhere in the world. Now, the goal of the proposed EU regulation would be to set up an EU system for supply chain due diligence on 3TG that originate from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. The goal, of course, is to help assure that the purchases of those 3TG are from legitimate sources. Now, it's important to remember that most companies don't purchase any of these minerals directly from the mine or from smelters or refiners. Many more of them are farther down the chain than that. So in order to get information that you'll need to meet your reporting requirements, you'll need to make inquiries of your suppliers and require your suppliers to make inquiries of their suppliers and so on. So supplier engagement is absolutely critical to this process, and compliance really cannot be accomplished any other way. 2014, the European Commission developed a proposed conflict minerals regulation, which was voluntary, would cover EU importers of 3TG, would focus on due diligence with respect to 3TG from all conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and promoted the use of the OECD guidelines for the framework of the due diligence efforts. Now, interestingly, in general, industry was fairly happy with this proposal. Then in May of last year, the European Parliament took up the matter, and there was a heated debate on certain portions of the proposal that were seen as too business friendly. The side that wanted the regulation to do more won out in that debate, and there was a close vote. And as a result of that, about 50 amendments to the Commission's proposal were made by the Parliament. Obviously, we won't go through all those. The most significant changes were to change it from a voluntary system to a mandatory system. Also, therefore, it focused on, instead of self-certification, a more objective certification process. The system still requires due diligence along the entire supply chain, covering EU importers of 3TG, but also all downstream companies that have 3TG in their products. This is a very significant change. All downstream companies would include companies that purchase from the smelter or refiner all the way down the supply chain to the brand or the retailer or the ultimate customer. So this includes component manufacturers, product manufacturers, and OEMs. It's a very significant change. According to the Parliament's own estimates, this addition would expand the scope of the EU regulation from just 400 European importers, which was originally proposed, to approximately 880,000 European companies, many of which obviously would be small and medium-sized enterprises. And as a result of the recognition of the burden that would put on SMEs, the Parliament proposed some technical and financial assistance to SMEs to help them comply with the regulation. And it is expected that SMEs would, in the ultimate regulation, receive some financial aid through the Commission's COSME program, which focuses on competitiveness of SMEs. The rule as revised by Parliament would continue to focus on due diligence guidelines from the OECD and would continue to focus on 3TG sourced from all conflict-affected and high-risk areas. The important thing to remember about this is that there's no set list or identified group of countries or areas involved in this. Companies are unsure about how they will identify those areas, and they're asking for more certainty on that point. So how does this proposal vary from the existing U.S. rule? Again, we'll only cover a few of the elements, but the EU regulation would apply to importers of 3TG into the EU and all downstream companies. The U.S. rule applies to public companies that are the ones that have to make the filings and the reports. There are fewer than 1,400 companies that have made conflict minerals filings with the SEC. So it's a much smaller number than we were talking about European companies being impacted. The different focus by the European regulation on all conflict-affected and high-risk areas is much bigger and broader than the U.S. rule, which simply focuses on the Democratic Republic of Congo and the adjoining countries. And the EU regulation includes some incentives to make companies eligible for public contracts if they comply, and there's no such regime with the U.S. rule. And how is the EU regulation similar to the U.S. rule? Again, we'll just mention a couple. What is consistent between the two is the focus is on 3TG. Those are the only minerals that have been named. The mandatory due diligence system is also consistent between the two. And there's also an element of independent third-party audits of certain due diligence practices being involved in both the U.S. and the EU regulation. But again, consistent between the two, there's no ban on conflict minerals involved in these regulations. It's important to remember. The regulations do not promote an embargo of any certain areas. In fact, they seek to do the opposite and improve responsible sourcing from those areas. I've included here a reference to the OECD guidelines because they're so important in developing the framework for the required due diligence. So this is a critical resource for you. The legislative process for the draft regulation has progressed some in recent weeks. The process is in the trialogue negotiation phase, which involves some informal meetings between the European Council, European Commission, and the Parliament to reach some consensus on the legislation. And it's important to keep in mind what's going on and who is in charge here and who's pressing forward. The presidency of the Council is now held by the Netherlands, and we are told that completing the work to create this EU system is a high priority for the Dutch presidency. In fact, it was identified as such in an official list of priorities that was published before the Dutch presidency's term began. So they hope to conclude those trialogue negotiations before the end of June of this year, which is the end of their presidency term. So concluding that would really be seen as a significant accomplishment, and they're very motivated to try to get that accomplished. However, because this dossier is very complex and there's a lot of negotiation to occur, it may run to the next presidency, which will be held by Slovakia. Now, according to our EU contact for this dossier, the most controversial issue remains whether the system will be voluntary or mandatory. So that's interesting that that is still in play. Also, if the regulation is mandatory, it's very likely that there will be some transition period before it takes effect. The Parliament amendments proposed a 2-year transition period, but I would caution you not to be fooled by the length of a transition period. There's a lot of work to do to get up and running. And remember, it's 2 years, probably 2 years to reporting, not 2 years to start of work. So I am urging companies to start laying the groundwork now for their compliance efforts. There's also been some recent discussion about the role of cobalt in the financing of armed groups in the Congo. So question, might cobalt be added to the list of conflict minerals? We've learned that such an addition would be possible if it's called for during the trialogue negotiations and if a consensus is reached on the issue. But remember, it was not included in the original mandate. And finally, following the adoption of final legislation, there will be a date set for when the regulation enters into force. It will be automatically applicable in all member states in the same form, and there was no need for separate drafting into national law of the member states. And the regulations will be binding on in all the member states as drafted. So what steps can a company take to build an initial conflict minerals compliance program or to expand your existing compliance program to meet what will likely be the requirements of the EU regulation? You'll want to keep in mind that your compliance program really should be adaptable and expandable because there are likely to be more responsible sourcing and supply chain transparency regulations that will come, and you'll want to be able to respond to them in an efficient way without creating a new system each time. Also, some important things to keep in mind. First, you're going to want to learn as much about the regulation as possible. This seminar is one step in that process, but I urge people not to try to become an absolute expert on every element before taking additional steps, because the hardest part is getting started, rolling up your sleeves, sitting around a table in your organization with the key team and getting started. The focus, you'll want to focus a great deal of attention on gathering detailed information about your products. These conflict minerals regulations require companies to know their products and what's contained in them. So bills of material, recipes, engineering specs, all of those things need to be gathered. Now, chemicals companies and pharma are pretty well suited for this because they know exactly what's in their products. Electronics, automotive, other manufacturers have a tougher job of this because companies in those industries often don't have detailed bills of materials or product recipes in hand, and so that needs to be done. You will also want to take a really careful look at your business to identify the risks that come from where you operate and where your suppliers are located and what raw materials and minerals are included in your products. So on this page, I've listed 10 elements or categories of thinking that you'll want to do as you develop your compliance program. They are covered in more depth in my compliance tips, and the link for which is attached at the top of the page. So running through them quickly, and these are really important and they'll vary from organization to organization, but plan your internal organization approach for this. You'll want to identify who is going to be on your internal team and your core team. It's important to get senior management support for this effort, so someone should be included on that internal team. Your product and procurement background and status, there's a lot of work that needs to go into this, and it will take some time and could be started at any moment. Yeah. Take a look at industry group involvement. Investigate what activities are taking place within industry groups that represent you and your industry. This is a really important key to compliance that is effective and efficient. Eventually, you'll need to identify the conflict-affected and high-risk areas that are involved in your supply chains. There will probably be some more guidance that comes later about identifying where those are. You'll want to coordinate an IT system that connects with your supply chain management. This is really important. It's going to be a very time-consuming process, but you'll want to have something that can store, gather, analyze, report vast amounts of data as part of this process. You'll need to think through and plan your internal and external communications that will be involved in this, which includes contract terms and getting those contract terms into place. That will take a significant amount of time. And finally, plan the disclosure that will take place. You'll want to be thinking through who is doing that disclosure, who's planning that. Finally, and one final point here is it's really important to remember that there are a lot of stakeholders that will be reviewing and analyzing your public disclosure. So this is not just a tick-the-box compliance exercise. There are risks and threats that arise in connection with the disclosures that you'll make. And those could lead to significant costs and expenses and possibly serious threats to reputation and brand. So the stakeholders to pay a special attention to are the regulators and enforcement themselves, obviously. Your customers. Make sure that your disclosure matches up with the information you provide to them. That disclosure can impact your customer relationships. NGOs who will be reviewing, analyzing, scoring your disclosure. Activist consumers will use this information in their purchasing decisions and possibly in starting social media campaigns against you or for you. There are socially responsible investors that are becoming much more active in this area. And finally, there are potential plaintiffs who will be reading your disclosure, confirming what it says. They'll look to see if it matches other disclosure that you're making and your codes of conduct and policies. If they are not, you could see fraud claims and lawsuits as a result. So this is really very, very serious business. So I urge you to be careful and thoughtful about the compliance program, especially about the disclosure that comes as a result of it. and make sure that all of your publicly available disclosures and statements are accurate and consistent across the board. And make sure that the people in your organization that are preparing those disclosures are qualified to do that, know what's required, and that they know the other risks associated with making those disclosures. And next, you will be hearing from Leah Butler from EICC.
Thank you, Dinda, for that great introduction into some of the major similarities and differences between the pending EU legislation and the US legislation, and some of the key considerations for companies as they start to understand the impacts of these developments on their own internal compliance programs and on their engagement with their supply chain. So just to start off here, I'm going to be focusing really on some practical steps and tips building on Dinda's presentation that might be applicable for your company as you start to consider how to build out your compliance program, what are the existing tools that are available, and some sort of lessons learned and practices that have been in development in the U.S. since the Dodd-Frank Act, and since companies here have really improved their own internal conflict minerals compliance systems. So the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative, it was founded in 2008, and it started off in electronics, but has really expanded a lot into other industries. We have representation from aerospace, apparel, manufacturing, automotive, jewelry, and medical devices, and really the list goes on. We have over 300 members now representing an array of industries, and this is, I think really symptomatic of the growing interest and need for companies to really improve their internal compliance programs and anticipate some of the upcoming expectations around conflict minerals due diligence, reporting, transparency, and with the 3TG and then potentially beyond. So the CFSI really seeks to provide practical tips, tools, and resources to companies, downstream companies, on how to understand the source of minerals in their supply chain and how that understanding can contribute to company due diligence and compliance. So I've outlined a few of the key resources here and how they line up to the OECD's 5 steps as that really is sort of becoming the international standard around practices and policies around conflict-affected and high-risk sourcing. So these resources are really oriented towards downstream companies, but they may also be helpful for suppliers, those in your supply chain, to help better understand downstream company expectations and requirements. So we hope this is helpful for you as your company starts to engage on these issues, and just noting, as Dinda pointed out, that this could take time. It will take time. So the OECD guidance emphasizes how recommendations can be carried out individually or collectively, really depending on the size of the company and its position in the supply chain. The members of the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative have recognized this benefit and really, or this reality, and really try to work collectively to develop and refine these tools, processes, trainings, and awareness for their collective benefit. And we really welcome all companies' input into these tools and resources to maximize their impact. So currently, just kind of taking a broad look here, there are 3 existing bodies of work addressing conflict minerals reporting. There's the US Dodd-Frank Act, as Dinda talked about, and the related US Securities and Exchange Commission rule, as well as the OECD due diligence guidance. As EU regulations take shape, the CFSI will continue to add further guidance and supplements for companies operating across these various frameworks and across these geographies. And we see as a very positive development that the EU will include plans to recognize existing programs and schemes in the EU framework. But I think importantly, each of these already make reference to the OECD due diligence guidance. So I'm going to really be referring to that throughout the rest of this presentation, understanding that the details for the EU regulations will be forthcoming. So let's see, as the first step in the OECD guidance really sets out this expectations around establishing management systems to support the company's execution of its conflict minerals program. So there are a lot of existing tips around this, and I encourage you to look at those papers that Dinda just cited, as well as others that are available, to get an idea about how to assemble your team, how to establish those controls around transparency in the supply chain, and start to engage directly with your suppliers on these matters. As Dinda also said, I think downstream companies really have to recognize the facts and circumstances of their position several tiers removed from actual smelters and refiners, those that are focused with the third-party audits, when they think about data collection and risk assessment and risk management. I mean, given their place in the supply chain, they may have no direct relationships with smelters that are processing these ores. So working through industry groups and using industry tools to communicate and get information from the upstream supply chain is really, really crucial. So now I'd like to move into some of the processes and tools that your company may use to support your due diligence processes and your surveying of your supply chain to understand and identify risks. In a summarized form, downstream companies are expected to identify those pinch points in their supply chain, the smelters and refiners that are processing these metals, engage with them to understand the risks of that sourcing, and to see whether they've carried out all of the elements of due diligence. And this can be done through participation by existing industry programs. What I'm showing here is a snapshot of one of the tools that CFSI members have developed to facilitate this effort, where there's a survey mechanism that goes through the supply chain from the downstream company all the way through their direct suppliers and sub-suppliers, using a kind of a cascading method to identify risks and smelters in their supply chain. So this may be something you consider as you are trying to respond to customer requests on 3TG use in your products, or the smelters that are producing those metals, as a tool that's been widely adopted by industry and has become really an industry standard to share information on these details. An additional part of this effort to identify and assess risks in the supply chain relate to country of origin information that can be used in a company's risk assessment and reporting activities. Country of origin information is a direct product of the conflict-free smelter program's audit process that pins down where these materials actually come from at a country level. This information is used to support downstream companies' obligations under the Dodd-Frank Act, but also can be used in the risk assessment step within the due diligence guidance. However, there are also a range of other types of country of origin information your company might want to consider, including information you might gather from directly engaging with smelters in your supply chain, any publicly available information around whether or not a smelter or refiner is sourcing from a conflict-affected area or high-risk area, and any information they may publish on their own, perhaps on their own company's website. The CFSI recently released a new drafting guide. This is really to help facilitate and upstream companies navigate this whole supply chain mapping and data collection process. It's a tool that really walks through what the content of the form is, how to fill it out completely and accurately. And we hope it's a useful guide and maybe something that will definitely be built on over the coming year or so as more companies start to use this template, and as we continue to expand on and clarify some of the questions that help companies make conflict declarations, conflict minerals declarations. Continuing on the vein of capacity building and continual learning that I think is really an integral part of this whole process, whether the conflict mineral legislation applies to your company or to your upstream suppliers. We've developed some training specifically targeted to upstream suppliers around complex mineral due diligence. This is cited as one of the key activities that companies may do to build capacity in their supply chain, including training your upstream suppliers on your expectations around responsible sourcing, providing them with industry tools and reference materials that are currently available, using databases as a way to compile and share information among industries or across industries, and communicating company policies and best practices around responsible sourcing. So this is just one example. There are many others, but we certainly encourage you to take a look at the resources that are out there around supplier awareness and capacity building around due diligence processes. So despite a lot of the hard work that's been done and education around complex minerals due diligence and responsible sourcing so far, there are still a number of challenges. Education and capacity building really is an ongoing process. And just as an example, we still see reluctance among some smelters and refiners to undergo third-party audits as part of step 4 of the due diligence guidance. This is an activity that companies can get engaged in by actively requesting the smelters in their supply chain undergo an audit process, and to really communicate with them either through their supply chain, directly through an industry group, to make it clear what the expectations are and how they can achieve them. Of course, providing support along the way. There are many different ways you as a downstream company can influence the increased uptake of and acceptance of due diligence processes and actions upstream. These are just some of the key ones where CFSI intersects, including facilitating sharing practices and information with industry peers, trying to find incentives for smelters and refiners to undergo these processes, facilitating contact between companies to communicate directly with smelters and refiners on their requirements, and providing technical assistance. That could be one-on-one meetings, it could be funding technical assistance, it could be actually visiting the smelter and helping them undergo this and understand and undergo this process. There's a lot of ways that downstream companies can take advantage of the existing tools and platforms that have been set up, and also contribute to the expansion of those tools and platforms for a maximum impact. Just as an example of that, the CFSI has a database of a variety of 3TG smelters and refiners and non-validated companies. That is a sort of a 5-year-long compilation of information that's ever growing. This could be a way for your company to vet a lot of information, to see what the latest is about a particular smelter or refiner. There's a couple of different data fields included, including their compliance, status and dates, contact information, communication history. This is really all meant to increase the downstream companies' access to information about these entities and where they are in terms of demonstrating their due diligence activities, being compliant to existing protocols and standards across the different metals, and to publicly report on their due diligence activities. I think importantly, and I wouldn't be able to conclude a presentation without mentioning that the conflict-free smelter program is an independent third-party audit for both tin, tantalum, gold, and tungsten refiners and smelters. So downstream companies, after they complete the surveying process, may use those results to compare the smelters and refiners in their supply chain to those on CFSI's public smelter and refiner compliant list. In order for smelters and refiners to be included on this list, they have to go an independent third-party audit process that was developed by the CFSI with multi-stakeholder input to be consistent with the due diligence guidance. And of course, the ultimate intent of this program really is to diminish the demand for materials associated with funding conflict. So this is something that is under review right now, and we'll be continuing to think about how to ensure the program is adaptable and flexible to address sort of the evolving understanding of conflict-affected and high-risk areas from a geographic scope, as well as from a metal standpoint and from a high-risk standpoint. It's not just the DRC and adjoining countries, but where else is this an issue, and how can existing audit tools help meet those needs? As you can imagine, this whole process can be quite overwhelming. There's a lot of data and information, and even members that have CFSI members who've been around for a while and engaged on this issue will still come back and say, I'm lost, I don't know what the next step is, what are the expectations, how do I respond to this request? And I think you may experience something similar as you continue to get into these issues and develop your own systems. So there are a lot of free resources available, as we've already mentioned, and those resources really targeted at different actors in the supply chain, whether it's a smelter, an auditor, a supplier, a downstream company, et cetera. So definitely encourage you to take a look there. This is an example of some of the resources we've got available. This is really an ever-expanding list, and if companies feel there's a need for other content or special content to address certain circumstances, especially in the EU, that's something we can make available. And again, this is a public resource, so it really is meant to help everyone in the supply chain who are addressing these issues. So I hope this has been helpful to kind of put some practical tips out there on resources that are available to you, not just by the CFSI, but elsewhere. The CFSI does work across different parts in the supply chain. And though a lot has been accomplished so far, I think there's clear recognition of a lot of work to do. And so we're looking forward to continuing to work with companies both in the US and internationally within the EU to continue to meet these very important goals for human development. So next up, we'll hear from Lena Ramos with Source Intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. It's great work that you and the team do through the CFSI program at the EICC. It's made a real impact on the global community. And thank you, Jay, for that generous introduction. First off, let me start by saying it's an honor to present with thought leaders like Dinda and Leah, and to speak on behalf of Source Intelligence on the conflict minerals regulation. I think everyone agrees this sourcing regulation expanding across the globe is impacting all countries, and in particular the EU. I'm hopeful that Source Intelligence's learning curve over the last 5 years of implementing hundreds of conflict minerals compliance programs will benefit the audience today. Before we get started, I think it's important to note the EU is not a new market to Source Intelligence. EU-based global brands with significant revenue generated in the United States began conflict minerals compliance programs with Source Intelligence, and we now have over 4 years of experience implementing these programs that operate in over 15 different industries across 11 EU-based countries and include approximately 75,000 companies on our platform. So that's exciting for us to be a part of this webinar today. Lastly, to frame our perspective, it's not just conflict minerals that the EU companies are concerned about. We have programs that currently trace and secure validated data for clients for restricted substances such as chemicals, anti-corruption, most commonly code of conduct, and also cobalt. To add a personal touch, if any of our listeners are close to Amsterdam and would like to meet our international team, they're actually presenting on conflict minerals and smelter verification at an event called the Conflict Minerals Compliance and Supplier Sustainability Conference on Friday morning. That's 9 o'clock European Daylight Time, and I believe that's Friday the 5th of February. With that, let's get started. I have to agree with Leah. The whole process of conflict mineral compliance can be an overwhelming initiative that takes time, diligence, and is very data-driven. What makes it more overwhelming is the increased pressure from the responsible investor market, consumer activists, and non-governmental organizations or NGOs that are demanding more transparency in the supply chain and expecting that that transparency is supported with substantiated data. So we've seen in this scenario that the internal champion or individual within a company tasked with implementing a conflict minerals compliance program benefits from two things. Obviously, a cost-effective system that scales and validated data that they can trust. It's not about speed or simplicity when a company's reputation is at stake. It's about due diligence and validation. So we've created, with the input of cross-industry roundtables, a 5-step process that many of you may have seen. I'll cover it briefly here, but our 2015 Conflict Minerals Best Practice ebook includes a detailed explanation of this 5-step process, and at the end of my presentation I'll share a URL where you can get access to that document. If you look at this slide on the left side, Source Intelligence begins with helping our clients define the scope of their programs with product filtering. Of course, the products included will impact the suppliers in scope, and based on our tried and true onboarding process, we help determine which of the suppliers a company should include into the compliance program. Many times companies don't have complete or even accurate list of their suppliers, but the beauty of our database and our algorithms is that we have been able to provision or clean, if you will, supplier lists, and of course we give that back to the clients for their use going forward. And while it might seem that product filtering decreases the number of suppliers we include, what we've seen is a growing trend over the last 18 months where the average number of suppliers is actually increasing because global brands are not looking for just conflict minerals compliance, they're also looking to deliver a supply chain performance, and that includes a wider net of data we collect. And they do this because the system, this 5-step process that typically includes a wider net of the data we collect, can centralize the supplier information, and we can secure reportable and auditable information for a range of needs. So we start with conflict minerals, but again, they add code of conduct, cobalt, or chemical compliance. Now, if you move to the right, once we've product filtered for conflict minerals, the next phase of our process involves what we call the data collection or supply chain tracing phase. And specifically, we identify the place or regional country of origin of the 3TG mineral and follow that with identifying the potential risk associated with the data collected. So that's the tracing, RCOI, and due diligence icons that you see. A critical best practice that we see here has involved developing supplier relationships. We have on-site a multilingual supplier support team that's 24/7 and operates 365 days a year. And we've been able to document, a 44% improvement in their response time and achieve 100% completion for our clients because of the time and resources over the years that we've invested in building the Source Intelligence Business Operations Center or Supplier Engagement Team, part of our business. It actually enables us to effectively conduct that data assurance and assessment that you see in the 4th icon moving to the right. At Source, we strongly believe that software alone is really not a solution, not one that the C-suite or supply chain compliance directors and managers can depend on to meet their compliance expectations. What we take is a human technology hybrid approach where the data collection and the data validation can be done with technology so that we can conduct cost effectiveness, but every flag data point is checked for inconsistency when we benchmark it against the hundreds and thousands of data points that we have to validate or to do the data assurance and data assessment step. As I mentioned earlier, speed and simplicity are not our driving factors. Supply chain performance that can be substantiated with validated information is what we see the CEO, the CFO, the chief legal counsel, or risk managers prioritizing on, and that's how we've built our system. These three steps we term supplier engagement, and you can see that across the center bottom of this diagram. The last piece is the notion of substantiated information leads nicely into the final step, and that's the reporting step. We create reports consistent with the requirements of the regulating body, and of course we make that specific to the EU, but we also look to offer white papers from webinars that we've co-hosted with NGOs as they map out their vision of reporting and share how they arrive to company rankings for the reports that they publish annually. We've seen that there's been an amazing evolution of how the global brands we help not only implement conflict minerals programs to be compliant, but also look to ensure that they're taking a 360 approach with our support to think about what they file for the regulators or what they include in their corporate social responsibility reports and what they include on their websites, because all of this ties into the final reporting step and contributes to their profile of transparency and ultimately impacts their rankings. If we go to the next slide, I think the best way to appreciate the impact we've had in the EU is to take you through a case study of an actual client. Just very quickly, the company that we'll be talking about today is headquartered in the EU, and it trades on 15 global exchanges. It has over 30 billion euro in revenue, and it operates in over 130 countries with more than 40 subsidiaries, actually. For their initial program, the company in this case study entrusted us to take the 5-step process that I outlined earlier for 20,000 of their suppliers or platform users. Let me just take you a little bit through the detail, to summarize the challenge that this company had involved two things. Globalized supply chains that were falling under the scrutiny of the C-suite executives, and they were really specifically insisting on product stewardship that was safe, reliable, efficient, and sustainable for their customers. The second thing that was a challenge is that they were needing to integrate technology-enabled management systems, but they didn't want to lose the quality of supply chain performance that you get when you use, human touch versus technology only. And because of our human technology hybrid approach, the solution that they chose after a long vetting process was to deploy the Source Intelligence platform to enable data collection and reporting from upstream suppliers and downstream customers. Effectively, they saw this as a tool to empower their supply chain to exchange critical compliance information. It wasn't just a management system for suppliers, but again, it was upstream and downstream empowerment that they were looking for. And what I'd like to point out here is the critical role of supplier engagement. One of the biggest challenges all of our clients have, and this EU-based company featured in this case study was no exception, is the ability to actually secure the information needed from tens and thousands of suppliers. And what we did was deploy a dual approach of both education and support. In regards to education, what Source Intelligence did was we leveraged a resource that we have. We've been contracted by 7 industry associations to create an educational resource center to serve 15,000 member companies and over 100,000 of their suppliers. And it includes an online education module that the suppliers can take, and when they successfully complete, download a certificate of completion on conflict minerals education. And if you sign up for our newsletter, we're actually offering complimentary access to that resource center, and at the end of the talk I can give you a link where you can do that. The education aspect of our approach not only increased the response rate, but it improved data quality. Again, we didn't feel the right thing to do was rush a supplier through a survey or try and simplify a process. It was about the education so that they could truly understand and appreciate supply chain performance for conflict minerals, and then securing the data so that the client, or the EU-based company in this case, could trust the data that was being collected. And of course, we had our validation systems in place after that. Again, for the role of the supplier engagement, the second component of our dual approach in this case study was support. And specifically, this EU-based company felt that relationship building that began with the introduction of Source Intelligence as their authorized agent was important in terms of a program that could scale. And we mapped out not only the support of the introductory stage, but we also mapped out clear prioritization of which customers that they would want us to work with, as well as an escalation process for suppliers that were non-responsive. And the two aspects of education and support were central to the program's success for this EU-based case study, and it allowed us to implement and grow an effective and efficient method in three ways. The customer from the EU was able to comply with downstream customer data requests. They were also able to provide robust processes and auditable data, which was important for their own management systems. And then lastly, they were able to deliver on the specific C-suite goals that I mentioned earlier in product stewardship. So that's very specific to this particular case study. Over the last 5 years, this slide's actually titled Leveraging the Learning Curve. And the reason is, over the last 5 years, the team at Source Intelligence has stayed committed to leveraging our learning curve for the benefit of customers and global brands that we work with, and quite frankly, for other stakeholders in what we call the ecosystem of conflict minerals compliance. And when I say learning curve, I like this visual because it really captures the extent of time and experience we've gained by showing the global reach of our network. What you see here are spots of where our suppliers are concentrated across the globe. And it also gives you an indication of the massive amounts of data that we use, not only for our validation, but again, what it took to get up this learning curve. The good news is that we at Source Intelligence have actually gotten up the learning curve as a conflict minerals expands across the globe. It's our hope that companies and stakeholders that we partner with can benefit from this data. I'm just about out of time, but I promised a few things during my talk, and I wanted to be sure you had time to jot those URLs and resources down. Many of our EU clients have considered these valuable resources, and so I just want to highlight 4 of them. The Best Practices ebook that expands on that 5-step process we covered earlier. The Source Intelligence newsletter, as I mentioned, the subscribers to that newsletter have free access to the Conflict Minerals Resource Center. So if you go into that and then look for resources, you'll find complimentary registration to the Conflict Minerals Resource Center. I'm including my contact information in case you need to contact me. I'd be happy to facilitate getting any of your needs addressed. If you could just put into the subject line EU conflict minerals, then I'll be sure to associate it with this webinar. And then lastly, if you want to meet Jordan Groves and the EU team, like I mentioned earlier, he's in Amsterdam and in the EU for the first part of February. Just send him an email, and I'm sure he'd love to find a way to connect. With that, I thank you for your time, and I will give it back to Jay for closing remarks. Jay?
Thank you, Lena, for that very insightful case study. It looks like we are out of time for today, so we'll follow up with any questions via email shortly after we conclude. I'd like to say thank you to Dinda, Leah, and Lena for sharing with our audience today. As a reminder, this webinar recording and slides will be emailed to you shortly after we conclude. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email education@sourceintelligence.com. We have many resources available on our website in our webinar library, or if you would prefer to read something instead, please check out our white paper library. Well, that's all, folks. This is Jay Sailing with Source Intelligence. Thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.